Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our conversation, Can a Social Justice Movement Go Too Far? A Canadian Case Study. My name is Brandy Shufatinsky, and I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I'd like to welcome our guest today, Ellie Avishai. Ellie is a strategist, teacher, and nonprofit leader. She founded I Think Initiative at the Rotman School of Management, which teaches real-world problem solving to students, teachers, and education leaders. She's also the co-founder of the Mill Center, which builds communities and promotes productive dialogue. Hi, Ellie. Also joining us is Jonathan, who's the Quillette editor, podcaster, and advisor to the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. His books include Among the Truthers, Legacy, Panics and Persecution, and Magic in the Dark. In 1998, John was a founding member of the National Post editorial review. Hi, John. Thanks for joining us.
How are you? Nice to be included.
I'm doing well. So can you tell us a little bit about if there's anything you want to add to the introduction, and also where you're located?
Sure. I'm located in Toronto, Canada. I was just telling John that I'm kind of midtown, midtown Toronto. And I guess the only thing I would add is that I'm the Mill Institute at UATX. Our mission is really to help students and teachers deal with really challenging, controversial topics in classrooms in a way that promotes nuance and compassion. So that's sort of where I enter this conversation from today.
Thank you.
I'm also in Toronto, and I say that with some hesitancy because the issue of media geographical concentration in Canada is actually a problem. Many talking heads are located in Toronto. It's actually maybe one of the problems we can discuss. But yeah, I'm also in Toronto. I've been involved in the Canadian media since joining the National Post, I guess, almost 25 years ago. And yeah, I'm delighted to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Thank you both. Well, John, you mentioned it being a little bit of a problem, the media being concentrated in Toronto. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Now, I think this is a problem that exists in, like, some version of this problem exists everywhere, right? In the United States, people talk about like the coastal elite. Australia has a version of this problem in terms of, it's just this natural concentration of journalists in the big cities, and then maybe the rest of the country, which is seen as flyover country, so to speak, gets ignored. In Canada, the problem is particularly acute because there is such a close collaboration between, I would say, government officials and media. Like, Canada is different from the United States in the sense that almost all our media are government subsidized. So like our film industry is almost 100% government subsidized. Our book industry, the magazine industry, lately, though to a lesser financial extent, but still significant, our newspaper industry is government subsidized. And as a result, it isn't just the sort of natural coalescence of cultural creators and editors and publishers and broadcasters in the big cities. This happens everywhere. But because government funding and government collaborations and partnerships, the subsidies are such a huge part of the media landscape and the university landscape. We have very few private universities. This clustering effect of universities, media, government institutions in a few places, specifically Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver, also Montreal, although there's a regional language issue. Of course, Quebec is largely French, so that's maybe we should leave that out. Even though it's a country of like 40 million people, you do get dominant cliques of very well-connected individuals who, again, this has always been the case, but I think it's particularly visible now in the Justin Trudeau era, where a completely unrepresentative group of people are setting, say, the editorial tone at places like the CBC, which is our state-funded national broadcaster. I don't think there's any real parallel, for instance, in the United States regarding the scope and scale of ideological control and concentration in those groups.
So, Ellie, I want to ask if you agree with that assessment where you have kind of the loud voices not necessarily being truly representative of the larger population, and if you agree with that, if you see how that possibly impacts education policy, curricula, as your, within your expertise as an educator.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And, I think in education, it's not so much necessarily sort of geographic concentration. There's just a concentration of sort of, there's sort of a monopoly on how teachers get trained. So, the big schools of education have a pretty similar set of ideological commitments.
Like OISE.
OISE is a great example, where, if you look at the course catalog at a school like OISE, and you go through and see sort of the different classes that students are learning, there is so much, there's just such a narrow, really, scope of things that people are learning about. You're going to get a lot of courses on equity. You're going to get a lot of courses that are focused on identity. You're not going to get a lot of courses that stray very far out of that realm. And frankly, even in classes that don't necessarily have sort of identity driven topics as like their primary, like as their title, it's still going to be kind of dominant in the course. As a matter of fact, the other day I had a conversation with a new teacher. She was sort of I think I'm trying to think if she was at York or at OISE, but she was taking a class in evaluation, measurement and evaluation for classrooms. And she said, I've been in this class for, several months already, and we have never even looked at a rubric, which is like the primary structure that teachers use to evaluate students. We haven't even done that. She said, right now, what I'm doing is I have to write an essay on how my identity makes an impact on the way I teach. She said, my background, I'm from India. I don't even know how I'm supposed to answer this question. It just seems so irrelevant to my ability to be able to really teach my students well. And I actually just want to know how these evaluation mechanisms work. And she hasn't even been given that opportunity, and she was incredibly frustrated. And this isn't like I was sort of handpicking someone. I literally sat down next to her at a wedding reception and just kind of started chatting. And that's what you're going to hear from a lot of teachers right now.
So, that kind of ties into the whole theme of what we're discussing today, looking at, okay, can a social justice movement go too far? So would you say that this is the case of social justice movements driving policy? Is it coming from, these very small but loud segments of Canadian society that's impacting media, impacting education and teachers and curricula?
Oh, sorry. Is this?
I want to ask both of you, John.
Is it okay if I jump in?
Please.
So what I would say is that the dynamic is interesting, because I think it's important to emphasize that in Canada, as in the United States, the whole social justice movement, as we now call it, has a very important grain of moral truth to it. Much as in the United States, I think there was, obviously there's been a reckoning over race that goes back generations, and but the modern iteration of it began in earnest in 2020. Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. And Canada sort of had something of the equivalent of that in terms of Indigenous issues. So Canada's funny because we have Indigenous issues where social justice is, there's a brutal legacy in Canada, and there's much for Canadians to account for and for the government to account for. So obviously that's a completely legitimate social justice movement. But what happens is our educators and government officials, they go on social media and they also onboard all of the US social justice jargon and intersectionality and critical race theory. So we kind of have our own homegrown social justice movement, which largely, though not exclusively, focuses on Indigenous issues. and we've imported all of the US jargon and all of the US race obsession. So the result is that it's double-barreled. And what happens is, and I think the education sphere is a really good example. My kids have all gone through public education. The teachers I've had in public education here in Toronto, I think have been very good. And often you can see them straining against some of the more ideologically dictated material that they get from OISE, which I think is the Teachers College of University of Ontario. But the rank and file, there's always a few ideological enforcers in the ranks. But what's happened is usually, and I think you see this in the United States, there's kind of like a balance of forces where the education ministry or education officials and the unions and parents. And in Canada, because everything is so cliquey, you often in places like, for instance, Ottawa, in Toronto, it's harder because it's the bigger city, but in places like Ottawa or Waterloo, these are kind of like second tier cities. The same group of like a dozen highly ideologically driven people can become highly influential in, say, the local teachers college, in the teachers union, where they may become like sort of director of equity for a teachers union, and at their local school board, they could become a school trustee. And again, because we don't really have charter schools in Canada, because so much money gets funneled through such tiny pipes in Canada, it has been much easier for people, small groups of people, to co-opt the system. And again, to be fair, the original social justice mission many of these people had was completely legitimate and remains legitimate. It's just, I think they've taken it too far. But we don't really have checks and balances here in Canada for pushing back. Like in the United States, just because of the political culture there, if a school board goes too far, you'll often have people like literally up in arms at meetings, protesting, and sometimes they go too far too. Like they try and intimidate school board officials physically, and I don't think there's any place for that. I think that's awful. Canada doesn't really have that kind of political culture, so we don't really have the checks and balances. And I think maybe that's why Canada presents a case study, like a cautionary tale, when you have small groups of people and you don't have the checks and balances, pushback. Unions used to be pushback against this, but I guess we can talk about that a little bit. But they've been captured by the same people. They don't, when it comes to these issues, they don't really represent the rank and file. They kind of take their orders from the same Twitter accounts that the administrators are taking their orders from. So it's like there's no real. They're kind of used to be union and administration were on different teams. Now they're kind of on the same team on these issues, and it's workers, rank and file, who kind of get shafted by it.
Yeah, I think that's really astute, and that connects a lot with what I see. I mean, I've been sort of undertaking a kind of an unofficial project for the last while, just to interview teachers across mostly Ontario, but a bunch of teachers in Canada, and I just keep hearing the same story again and again and again, which is that they're feeling like there's less trust than they've had before with their administration, a feeling that
I'm sorry to interrupt. Less trust, like meaning that the administration isn't trusting them to execute their professional responsibilities, or?
Well, that too, but actually no, just that they don't feel as much sense. I mean, look, and this is like overgeneralizing, obviously. I'm sure there are plenty of schools where this is not the case, but I've heard from a lot of teachers who are feeling like, because of, I think, a lot of the dynamics, John, that you had pointed out, that people are getting, that administrators, for example, are getting promoted, let's say, in schools on the basis of what their ideological commitments are, their ability to sort of say, hey, their ability to sort of say the right things, as opposed to their ability to manage schools well, right? And those are two very, very different sets of skills, right? And that because there's this sort of ideological haze over sort of what the whole sort of promotion pipeline looks like inside public schools, that they're not really sure, kind of, they don't feel a sense of trust with their administrators in the same way that they used to. And there's a lot of frustration, a lot of feeling like, hey, I used to know sort of what my job was as a teacher. I used to be able to kind of do my job as a teacher. For example, if a student is in the hallway, in between classes, it was very clear what I was supposed to do. My job is to tell that student, like, you got to go to the office. You're not supposed to be here. Go back to your class. But now teachers are feeling like, actually, I'm not exactly sure what I can do or not do now. I'm not sure if I'm going to be seen as, unfairly being biased against that student if I do what I've always done, which is to sort of say, hey, like, that's not okay. You shouldn't be doing that. And this sort of sense of like not feeling fully trusting of their administrators, but also not being like super clear on what the rules are anymore, because there's been so much shakeup. People just don't know what to do. And so there's a lot of holding back in schools, especially around issues of discipline and grading and all of that. And that just, it creates a lot of chaos.
Can I
schools.
jump in on the trust issue? Because there's two case studies that I think are important. So I'm thinking in particular of the Peel District School Board, which has gone. So this is a huge, highly populated school district. It's in an area. I guess it is the west of Toronto suburbs. I don't know exactly the geographical boundaries, but it's an enormous school board. And I think it was last year they set in motion a new policy, which even by the standards of some of these policies that Ontario school boards have adopted, even this one was like crazy. They claimed the whole thing was mandated under the auspices of human rights law, which it wasn't. It went way beyond that. But of course, needless to say, it created a snitch line for if you hear anybody say anything like racist or bad or dehumanizing, call this number. It advised people to like write the email and phone number down like on a special place on their desk, just so they could. I think they anticipated a lot of snitching. But the creepiest part about it was they say, anybody who uses language we don't like or whatever is liable for suspension and termination. But then they included this provision that said, and if it is shown that you heard offensive language and that you didn't report it immediately using this hotline, you too shall be taken up on charges and could face all this. It was again.
This was coming from the board, from the school.
Oh yeah, no, this was right from the school board, top down. I got a copy of the memo. I put it on social media. People couldn't believe it. The other example I was going to give, this one in a way is crazier because it shows how horizontal trust has broken down within unions, the unions that were once supposed to protect teachers. So there was, I think this was Halton Waterloo. It was one of the, it was a meeting of the union for school teachers in a particular school board, and during the course of this meeting, it took place in a school. During the course of the meeting, there was this violent fight. It wasn't fist fight, it was this strenuous argument over whether reverse racism exists. And people were talking about like, look, we're going too far. This is reverse racism. And then other people at the meeting said, no, reverse racism doesn't exist. And the fact you use the term reverse racism means you're a big racist. Look, people can argue about that. What I found shocking about that is the people who were on the progressive side of the argument. And again, this is union members at a union meeting, happened to be in a school. They reported their fellow union members to the principal of the school on the basis that they felt their fellow union members were violating the Safe Schools Act and that their racism was making things unsafe for everybody. And they wanted their fellow union members disciplined on the basis of what they said at a union meeting that happened to be in a school. And they were leveraging the fact that geographically the meeting happened to take place in the school and say, you know what, we're going to snitch you to administration and we'll let them deal with you. I mean, not so long ago, these Canadian unions are fairly militant. I mean, compared to the American equivalents, and it was kind of like a lot of like all for one and one for all. There was a lot of like socialist rhetoric and the proletariat, the working class, and now you have the ideological enforcers in these organizations essentially mouthing exactly the same hyper progressive ideology as the people with whom they're supposed to be in economic conflict with, right? Like when they go into a negotiating room, everybody is reciting the same pieties. So yes, I mean, in some nominal, when it comes to wages, for instance, you still have, you know, the workers, in this case, the teachers, in conflict over how much they should be paid and stuff like that. There still is an element of opposition, but when it comes to ratting each other out over ideology, the reason there's no trust is because everybody is just one syllable away from one of their enemies in the next cubicle reporting them, and it's like in any organization where ideology gets weaponized for office politics. And if there's 5 people competing for a vice principal job, and you could take one of them out of the competition because you overheard that he, misgendered someone or something. Suddenly, there's 4 people competing for the job, and your chances go from 20% to 25%. So, a lot of this is just garden variety, toxic office politics that is now being weaponized with the idiom of social justice.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's a lot of there are a lot of parallels and similarities that we see in the United States as far as in schools and in academia. Maybe not as concrete and seemingly systematic how it's manifesting in Canada, but because of how we see it in the US, you see a big push for, say, school choice, and like you mentioned, we have charter schools. Are either of you, Ellie, maybe you know and have seen this in schools, are you seeing an active, coordinated pushback against this trend of trying to silence teachers and get people to kind of buy into the same ideology?
Active and coordinated, a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
last year especially, you've seen some.
Yeah, in this past year, yeah, and look, I mean, I do think that there is an active group of teachers and parents, and it is a coalition of teachers and parents, who are feeling very frustrated with what's happening in the school system, are feeling worried about what it means for their kids, and who have been, so for example, there's been like a pretty active attempt to get a set of trustees elected onto school, to different school boards, that were sort of deliberately running as kind of anti-woke, although a lot of them didn't even call themselves that. They just sort of had fairly reasonable ideas about what should be happening in schools, and then they were branded as such. I mean, how successful has it been? I think that what's been more successful is sort of the more subtle exhaustion that people feel with kind of maintaining a party line, and that I think you're like what you're hearing in conversations more and more among educators is kind of more of a casual willingness to say things that they think, which I think 2 days ago they probably wouldn't have, and things are starting to loosen up just a little bit in terms of casual conversation. I haven't seen a particularly effective sort of coordinated effort that feels like it's permeated very deeply into the public school system. John, I don't know if you have. I know you've been involved with FAIR, and I don't know if.
So one thing I've noticed, and again, this goes back to what we're saying about, or what I was saying about the structural interconnectedness of all these different cliques, is that in Ontario, certainly in and around Toronto, which is where the largest school boards are located, when you run for school board trustee, so it's an elected position, like in many parts of the United States, the political machine that elects school board trustees tends to be the junior varsity squad of the New Democratic Party, which is the main left-wing party in Ontario and federally and provinces. So unlike the United States, it's typically Democrat versus Republicans. There's only 2 viable parties. In Canada, in most parts of the country, there's at least 3 and sometimes 4 and even 5 viable parties. One of them is the New Democratic Party, which used to be a pro-labor party, but now has kind of become this sort of like caricature of wokeness. And like wokeness on behalf largely of upper middle class white people. And at the local level, if you are, say, a labor lawyer at a big Toronto firm and you want to make the transition to politics, maybe you're thinking that like 10 to 12 years from now, you want to be a member of parliament. You typically, a typical route would be you start running for school board official in your community. And that typically starts with phone calls, to the local NDP offices, and because you're often piggybacking, at least informally, on their infrastructure and their mailing list and stuff like that. Although there are supposed to be rules to prevent that. And then you become school board official, and you make a big name for yourself because you're on the radio talking about social justice and equity, and intersectionality and stuff, and you get noticed, and you become an NDP. MPP, or like you run for the provincial party, and then if you talk enough about social justice, maybe you'll be promoted to the federal party and you can run for MP, and who knows, maybe in 15 years you'll be in cabinet. But a lot of this starts at the school board level. So, and to be fair to progressives, conservatives and centrists have let this happen. Like this has just become this kind of accepted part of the political landscape that the NDP sort of runs things in local politics, in either formally or informally. It's not universal, but it happens a lot. And I mean, to be fair to woke people, like they did a lot of this while other people were sitting on their hands. I didn't get involved in school board politics. I just kind of assumed the school board was run by reasonable people. And a lot of my neighbors who complain about wokeness are the same way. So meanwhile, a lot of people who are like super into land acknowledgements and, have very complicated pronouns and, listen to Ibrahim Kendi a lot and have those signs on the lawn that says, "In this house, we blah, blah, blah." I don't know if you have those in the United States.
We do.
It's like this laundry list of of hashtags.
Believe in science.
Yeah. Because the rest of us are just like these superstitious Luddites. And so those people, as insufferable, and as a caricature, but, maybe as sanctimonious as some of us may find them, to their credit, at least they did the work of taking over these institutions. And often they didn't really have to work that hard to do it because a lot of the rest of our society we trusted enough in our institutions to figure, well, it's a school board. I guess they're going to sort of keep in mind the broad interest of the community and the public, right? Like, I just kind of assume that. And then the years pass and they don't. And it becomes this sort of like treehouse club for like hyper progressive upper middle class white people. And you're like, wait a sec, how did this happen? Like, how did they capture it? They captured it while the rest of us were busy doing other things. And now part of this conversation we're having is part of us not doing other things. But it's going to take some time. We just had one trustee election cycle, and I predicted, I said, I don't think much is going to come out of this except the kind of informal awareness that Ellie was talking about, where people started making connections on social media, teachers started talking to parents, Facebook groups started to form, candidates started, and people learn mistakes, right? Because like, if your anti-woke candidate is like an anti-vaxxer who has some weird theory about immigrants, like that's not good for your movement, right? And that person isn't going to get elected. And but that's part of the discipline of building a realistic movement, is that, you don't just get behind whatever hothead happens to say he doesn't like wokeness. The person has to be reasonable and intelligent. There's 100 different ways to be unreasonable, and just because you're anti-woke doesn't mean you fulfill those other criteria. So
yeah, absolutely.
But this is part of the teething stage for any political movement, and I think the next trustee election cycle will be a very important one.
Yeah. I think you're probably right. I mean, look, we can also ask the question why so many people have kind of gone along, and part of it, I think, is that there's been a kind of I don't know, an idea that has accompanied this current, whether we want to call it woke or social justice movement. I mean, I hate calling it social justice movement because social justice means so many things. And this is actually a fairly narrow movement, actually, I think. But there's this idea that the stakes are so high, right? The stakes of of groups in society being treated unequally or sort of having unequal outcomes, that the stakes are so high that we don't have time for nuance.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important that we kind of appreciate how powerful that idea is. Because if the stakes are so high that we don't have time for nuance, then it means that like our job then is to like reduce everything to some really simple, clear ideas and just pound them through, right? So for example, this notion that, like equality of outcomes between groups is always sort of, or what we're calling equity, is sort of always more important than equality of opportunity for individuals. And we translate that into a meme, and then our job is to get everybody on board, right? And in Canada, I think especially, we have a lot of receptivity for this idea that we want to reduce inequalities. I mean, that just, it speaks, I think, really to the heart of sort of Canadian socialism and the notion that we really want to create an equal society. But what happens is that then getting everyone on board becomes more important than being precise about the problems that you're trying to solve. And instead of having a lot of conversations about really exploring all these different ways we can understand sort of what makes people tick and how people identify themselves and who they identify with, and, how we understand things like race versus sort of economic inequality, or all these things that make these conversations actually interesting. Instead, we have a bunch of conversations about, are you with us or are you against us? Are you on board or are you not on board? And nobody doesn't want to be on board, right? So you end up with a lot of people who are kind of privately thinking, this isn't at all what I think is true. And I'm actually kind of worried that this is not just oversimplified, but actually maybe just wrong. But we accept a lot of ideas that are, that end up being, not just oversimplified, but perhaps just wrong, because we're trying so hard to be good people. And that I think is really driving a lot of what we're seeing here. And I also think that now people are starting to realize that it's actually a really big problem if we can't explore the rigor and the nuance around issues of race, of gender, of inequality, of fairness, of harm, all of these ideas that really sit at the heart of our society.
Brady, may I add something to that?
Please.
One thing that many political movements that in retrospect look misguided, one commonality they have is they often will create this sense of apocalypse. On the conservative side, for a lot of the people who supported Donald Trump, it was like America lies in ruins, or at least it's on the precipice. It's about to lie in ruins, and there's this urgent project to make America great again. Are you on board, or do you want to see America literally be destroyed? You need to answer the question now. And there were a lot of people who were like, well, I guess I do want to make America great again, and they had serious reservations about Trump. But when the question is presented, like, are you with us or against us? Often you'll say, okay, I'm with you. Like, I pointed this out often, that the rhetoric of progressive apocalypticists, when it comes to some of these narratives, it actually sounds a lot like what George Bush and his attorney general, a guy by the name of John Ashcroft, were saying after 9/11. Bush literally said, you're either with us or against us. And this is a common rhetorical tool where if you think by reducing things to that question, you're going to get 50% plus one, the winning side tends to be eager to reduce it to that question. And in Canada, the equivalent of that apocalypse narrative has been, minorities are literally being exterminated. The word genocide is now thrown around with great abandon. And at first it was like cultural genocide in regard to Indigenous people. The last couple of years, there's been this insistence that we say not only that there was a genocide inflicted on Indigenous people, but that the genocide continues to this day. So even as we're having this conversation, there's literally an active genocide going on in Canada. That may seem like a preposterous thing to say. Canada is one of the most peaceful countries on earth, but it has now become a heresy in highly progressive circles in Canada to say that Canada is not currently a genocide state, inflicting a genocide against its Indigenous population. Which, and I'm not speaking figuratively. That is the conceit that progressive Canadians have been asked to embrace, which would suggest that like Justin Trudeau has to go to The Hague to answer for crimes against humanity. Of course, like when you suggest that, they're like, no, that's not what we mean. But despite the fact that they're not willing to pursue the literal ramifications of the word genocide, they still insist that everybody use the term genocide. And of course, if the question is then asked, well, we have this policy for educators, but I guess, if you don't want to end the genocide, you don't have to support the policy. Like naturally, even people of good conscience who are reasonable are going to say, okay, well, give me a pen. I'll put the document in front of me. I'll sign it because I don't want to be accused of being pro-genocide. Yeah. And so this apocalyptic language has been weaponized in exactly the same way that conservatives in other eras and in other parts of the world have used it. I mean, nationalists use it all the time, right? Do you want to protect the country?
Right.
Are you a patriot? If you're not a patriot, you don't have to do this, but I thought you were a patriot. So it's very cultish in that respect, but it also can be very effective if people aren't allowed to express doubt. But I draw some hope from what Ellie was saying that at least casually now, people are willing to have conversations about like, is this language really warranted?
Yeah. And sorry, just one thing to add to that. Sorry, is that if people don't have a great sense of history and they're not like super educated about sort of the facts on the ground, and that's a vague statement, but in every particular area, then they're also much more likely to go along with those kinds of things. So, I think in Canada, for example, the question around policing is a really great example where, John, you were saying earlier how much we've imported from the US, and I think sort of our kind of the current progressive beliefs about policing in Canada really draws a lot of its information from progressives in the US and also the situation in the US, but actually policing in Canada is quite different than the US, and people don't really know.
Can I jump in with a specific example? Because I wrote a column about this.
Please.
So
please.
After the George Floyd was murdered, Ellie, you probably remember this. There was a march in the streets of Toronto. It was the black politics of Toronto are a little bit complicated. I forget if it was BLM or BLM inspired because there was like some schism groups. But let's just say it was a BLM inspired march in Toronto, and the marchers were saying that exactly the same problem they have in Minneapolis and other racist American cities they have in Canada. Like our police force it's exactly the same. And then I said, okay, well, let's take a look. And it turns out that on a per capita basis, if you're a black person in Minneapolis, you have a 30 times greater chance of being shot by a police officer than if you are a black person in Toronto. So, like, if you're in Toronto, your risk level is 3% of the risk level in Minneapolis. And remember,
what was the reception to that?
No one cared. I mean, and by the way, just to be clear, the figure we would all root for is like 0%. Right. One killing is one too much, and I have no doubt that there's racism. However, I have been embedded as a journalist in with police units in the Peel region, as a matter of fact. 50 years ago, you could say, well, it's just a bunch of white guys looking to shoot minorities, whatever. Like, our police force is now a sort of United Nations. Like, I'm sure there's work to be done in all these areas, but the unit that I was following, I was the only white guy in the car, and most calls that we were answering, there were multiple calls. Often I was the only white guy there, and the idea that somehow, like the most ludicrous comparison was to Ferguson, because of course in Ferguson, Missouri, which of course predated George Floyd, one of the scandals there was, I think, like the cops received like 8 weeks of training or 12 weeks of training. Like, right. Whereas if you look at the Toronto police force, The training regimen is extremely strict. Most of the people in the room, if several, often was everyone in the room had a college education. The oversight standards are extremely strict. It's like the level of professionalism is like much higher than at most American police departments. And yet there's this reductionist thing that says, oh, it's all the same. Ferguson, Minneapolis, it's just a bunch of thugs in uniforms looking to kill Black people. And it's an insult to the people who are actually pursuing social justice in many of these areas, like Ferguson. Like Ferguson was a legitimately racist place. That's why the feds intervened there, because it was a scandal what was going on there. And for activists in Toronto to simply like piggyback on that and just try and convince people that everything is the same everywhere, I think it's an insult to the people who are suffering in places where these problems are acute. But as Ellie was saying, it's very hard to push back on that. And the statistics that I cited, it's certainly, I don't think a single person said, oh, okay, well, I guess that'll change my political views. Because especially like in the days or weeks after something like the killing of George Floyd, it is a are you with us or against us moment. Mm-hmm. And to a certain extent, that's a good thing. Like, I mean, you do want people's better angels to be marshaled in those periods. Like, It's not, I'm not saying that's an entirely bad thing. It's, however, as the weeks and months go by and people are using this rhetoric, often in a kind of cynical way to advance agendas that are like very tangentially related to, like you say, oh, well, in honor of George Floyd, we need to have more affirmative action in the Canadian film industry. It's like, what? Like, how does that work? And so a lot of it becomes kind of like very, very cynical, and people learn to be cynical about it, but while mouthing the platitudes. Although, for reasons that Ellie said, I think that may be changing a little bit.
I hope so too. I see, and not just in Canada. I hope so that there's a tide shift here in the U.S. But I think a couple of things with the examples you gave. One, the push for urgency in the United States. We see this, but that specific word is used many times over, specifically related to gender affirming care, use of correct pronouns in schools in the United States. That's kind of a hot topic. But the other part is when you use terms like genocide for something that isn't a genocide, it also then minimizes actual genocides. So my question to both of you is, how do you think this then impacts students, Canadian Jews, Canadian Indigenous people, Black Canadians, when certain movements, social justice movements, get overtaken by rhetoric and ideology, and not the focus gets shifted away, or a group of people who actually experienced a genocide kind of get their experience gets minimized?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. It's reminding me of this recent report that came out of the University of Toronto Medical School, where, and I'm trying to remember the name of the woman who did the report. There was an op-ed, I think, it was either in the National Post or the Globe and Mail this morning. You might know, John.
I forget her name, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, basically, so there was a woman who had sort of gotten called upon to take a look at what was happening in terms of anti-Semitism at the medical school, and some of the things that, and it was actually kind of interesting, actually, because I read her actual report, not just the op-ed, and she actually in many ways buys into a lot of the same ideas that I think are kind of creating the problem. So it was sort of an interesting report to read. But one of the things that she really pulled out is that there was so much belief that, if a person, for example, Jewish, or not, has a certain colored skin, has light skin, then therefore they're not really allowed to even engage in a conversation about something like, for example, generational trauma. It was actually it was almost funny, except I found it very painful that she had been reporting somebody saying something like, Jews are just stealing the idea of generational trauma from Indigenous communities. And it was like the lack of historical understanding in that statement was so profound. And the notion that somehow, like, that two groups of peoples who have both experienced very genuine generational traumas couldn't actually, like, that couldn't possibly coexist, because everything is because things are so simplified. You are either in a category of oppressor, or you are in a category of oppressed. I'm certainly not the first person who's talked about this. And that, as Jewish people, we are in the category of the oppressors because of the color of our skin, and therefore everything that we have to say about our own cultural experience is kind of like a dog whistle, or like a that, or not a dog whistle. What's the word I'm looking for? Like kind of bait and switch. It's really problematic, and I think that it's the oversimplifying of these things that make it really difficult for people to just sort of meet each other where they're at.
So somebody, Mars commented that most aren't informed of the facts on the ground, much less the fundamentals of a liberal democracy. And you see a backlash against the marketplace of ideas as a result. And I think that really hits the nail on the head as far as this push for you're with us or against us, answer us now. It's urgent. We have to address it, and you have to pick your side now. And there's no time for a discussion, conversation, and questioning. And thinking about then how that perhaps fuels anti-Semitism, where you're immediately judged by the color of your skin. And that means that you don't get to speak about your experiences or the experiences of the community, one of the communities in which you belong. And so my question is, with that trend going, what would you say to, a Jewish Canadian kid in 11th grade that's hearing this type of stuff in the classroom?
Well, it's complicated. So, Ellie, I think you know more about what kids are saying, but one thing. So as a parent, one of the maddening qualities of kids is if you say up, they say down. If you say black, they say white. Like, kids are just naturally rebellious. And yet it's also one of their greatest qualities, because it means that they have a sort of natural pushback. I mean, sometimes it's natural pushback against things that they shouldn't be pushing back. And it's like, I need you to be home by 2 a.m. It's like, why? I'll just sleep on the street. Like, sometimes it's like you need them to listen to you. Mm-hmm. But one phenomenon I've noticed is that 15, 16, 17-year-old kids, they now come to see wokeism as like this fuddy-duddy ideology. So, their 28-year-old English teacher with blue hair is telling them about intersectionality and stuff. And it's kind of like, oh, whatever you say, grandma, like, and sometimes they take it too far. Like at a school in our neighborhood, like, someone in the bathroom was like writing like how much he likes, graffiti, how much he likes Kanye West and what he said. And like, this kid probably had no idea what Kanye West says, but it's like this language of rebellion. It's like, well, my teachers are saying that Kanye West is bad, so therefore I'm going to be a rebel and say he's good, which is kind of a stupid thing to do. But you have this reflex, this adolescent reflex to rebel. And sometimes when I talk to kids, whether Jewish or not, I have to like actually caution them and say, look, I get it that it's like fun to sort of push back and poke people in the eye, but you have to be smart about it. And I see, like, I now know one of my kids is college age, and I see these college age kids, people ask them their pronouns and they have to go to all these like orientation sessions. And a lot of them, honestly, they just do these orientation sessions. 95% of them are on their phone. They've heard it all before. They think it's dumb. They're like kids anywhere. It's like, it's, and I think for Jewish kids, they're facing the same situation where a lot of them don't want to rock the boat. They don't care. They find it exasperating. But what I try and encourage kids to do is embrace the multiplicity of existence. There are 6th or 7th generation German Jews in the United States who are every bit as white and privileged as the Rockefellers or whatever. Like, you know, their family might have been in the United States since the early 19th century. They're non-observant, you know, their name is Miller or Smith, and the fact that they're nominally Jewish has no effect on their life, and they don't experience anti-Semitism. Or you could have Jews who, you know, they're Sephardic Jews who are just recently arrived from North Africa, or, you know, maybe their English isn't great. And maybe they've suffered racism in parts of North America. And like their experience is very analogous to people of color in the United States. But to lump all Jews together and say you're either in the oppressor category or you're in the non-oppressor category, like is just completely ludicrous. And it symbolizes one of the things we hate so much about this movement is like they're more obsessed with putting people into like racial categories than you know, the segregationists of the mid 20th century. Like it's all they think about is, what bucket am I going to put you into? Like the good bucket, the oppressed, or the bad bucket, the oppressor? Like, how about we just dispense with the buckets? Like, why?
I think it's interesting that how you framed that, because there's also the idea that if you hold privilege, that automatically means you've oppressed someone or something to get it.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an inherent guilt trip, and then the other thing is it becomes this like morbid, sanctimonious confessional. It's like, I will use my privilege for good, which like is almost more annoying, because then they turn it into this kind of like they're rending their garments in front of you, and you're like, I don't want to see you rend your garments. Like, get off your knees. Stop confessing to things. You know, this is one of the things is we associate wokeness with being accused of things, but 90% of the time it's not. It's like a religious ceremony where they're treating you like a priest in the confession booth, and you just want them to shut up. Like, if you really feel that shitty, like just go work at a food bank. Or one of the amazing things about American society is statistics show that the people who do the most volunteer work are religious Christians. Whether they're black, whether they're white, you know, religiously observant, more generally conservative people in the United States give more to charity and spend more time actually doing charitable work, often with their local church. And those are the people who everyone's always like, you know, treating as the scum of the earth because they're, you know, maybe they're Trump supporters or they're conservative or they're oppressors or whatever. I mean, I wish more of the people, Jewish or not, and by the way, in Toronto, a lot of the progressive Jews, I mean, whole synagogues have been taken over by this nonsense where it's like the real religion is wokeness and the Judaism is just like a hobby. And if they would just spend a fraction of that time on actual good works, helping the community, like in a concrete way, like not hashtags or not like confessions or adding crap to their email signatures about how they're on stolen land or whatever, like go out and do good things, Canada would be an immensely enriched place, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to add one very small thing, which is sort of back to this notion of like what I would tell a high school student, and that is just that I don't think I would actually tell them any kind of summary conclusion or any kind, you know, like I think what we need to do is to get back to this notion that education is about presenting sort of a wide swath of ideas and asking the student to do the uncomfortable thing, the difficult thing, which is to try to make sense of it. Right? I mean, that's what real education is. That's what interesting public discourse sounds like, is grappling with questions that we know have no answers, where there is no certainty, and where the job of kind of advancing society is in the acknowledgement of that lack of knowing, and asking a student to say, you know what, like that's your job and it's hard, and I'm not going to tell you what to think about Israel, and I'm not going to tell you what to think about, you know, who's good and who's bad. Guess what? I don't know, and neither are you ever going to really, but you're going to have to make up your own mind about it. And you know, one of the biggest challenges I think we're facing in education right now is a tendency to move away from that way of thinking about education, and more to a way of thinking of education that says our job is to make sure that everybody's really good, and therefore we have to tell them what they need to believe in order to be good, because we really care about being good, right? And in so doing, you end up basically ripping away the most important element of education, which is that real struggle, that grappling. So, and that's true. It's true for those of us in the Jewish community. I mean, that's actually the heart. I mean, come on, that's like the heart of what so much of Judaism is all about, is sort of this acknowledgement that we're in a constant debate and struggle over what things mean.
Well, it's the Talmudic tradition,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah. And by the way,
Yeah.
I'm the oldest person on this call, and when I was a kid, I went to it wasn't formally a Christian school, but it was a very culturally Christian school. We sang the Lord's Prayer, we said grace at lunch. It was a very old-fashioned boys' school. We had a class called Moral and Religious Education, MRE. And MRE was about how to live, essentially how to live like a good Christian existence. Although, to be clear, it wasn't like there was crucifixes or anything, but it was an old-fashioned class of, there was some sermonizing and all that stuff. And I associate it with a very conservative impulse. And I thought of it just yesterday. Ellie, I don't know if you saw it, but I tweeted about the new transgender student coordinator at the Ottawa Carleton District School Board.
Oh, no, I didn't see that
one.
one.
Yeah, this, God, what's her name? Sarah Sonoya or something. And I mean, she was tweeting how ecstatic she was. And then on her public account, she had like her lesson plans and all. She posted it all publicly. It wasn't like I was speaking out of school. And for Trans Visibility Week, she posted her whole lesson plan that she was doing with her kids. And the plan was everything you'd expect. Just to be clear, transgender people should be treated with respect. They should not be discriminated against. You shouldn't be fired from your job because you're trans. I think everybody, acknowledges these things. But of course, this was the usual stuff. It was over the top. Like, are you born in the wrong body? Like, it was just complete nonsense. And then at the end, the last slide, and I tweeted it, the last slide was, now it's time to take the pledge. And if you are an educator and you end your lesson on this issue or any other issue with a pledge, you're in the religion business, or you are in the politics business where, you're at some Republican primary and, do you pledge to make America great again? Put up your hand, now let's sing the national anthem. Like, this is a political project or it's a religious project. It's not an educational project. If you're asking people to pledge in front of everybody else, because if everybody else in the classroom is pledging and you're not pledging, what's wrong, comrade? Do you want to genocide transgender people? Is that why you won't do the pledge? Like, oh no, I'll do the pledge. That's not education. And again, this person has just been signed onto a school board wide position where she's in charge of this issue for thousands and thousands of students. So that's what Canada, Ontario in particular, has become. And so you can see why there's a backlash against this stuff.
Mars has a question. With the emphasis on safetyism, has that arena been blunted? In a school board meeting, the idea of feeling unsafe, it makes excuses for people to dodge when they're forced to confront nuanced pushback to their perspectives. And this kind of goes into the push to kind of mute people, have them self-censor, disallow for questioning and conversation and engagement. And for something like an educator, a school board member, or somebody in charge of DEI asking the people that they're teaching and speaking with to take some sort of loyalty pledge is, in my opinion, just another iteration of that. But what do you think the impact of the idea of well, I don't feel safe, we need safe spaces? How has that impacted this trend?
Oh, I mean, I think it's made a huge impact, and it's a little tricky because this notion of safetyism and safe spaces, it's like it's emerged sort of alongside and with some of the things we're talking about. I'm not 100% sure it all comes from exactly the same place, but I think it's had a huge impact. And it certainly had a huge impact in classrooms. I mean, I know, as a matter of fact, I was just speaking a little while ago with a high school student. She just began grade 9 this year. And I asked her how things were going. And she said, my teacher put up a slide on the first day of school that said that harmful views will not be tolerated. Right. So, I mean, there's so many things wrong with that statement. I can't even begin so the first day framing. But what she said is, I have no idea what will get me sent to the principal's office. I have no idea what I'm allowed to say and not say, because I'm afraid that if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to lose everything. I'm going to lose my friends. I'm going to be kicked out. I just don't know. She said, I feel like the connections that I'm making in school are fake, because I'm spending so much time worrying about what I'm saying and not saying, that I feel like people aren't becoming friends with me. They're becoming friends with censored me. Right. I mean, that's like an outrageous thing for a 13, 14-year-old girl to feel when she's sitting in a classroom. And so the impact, this idea that ideas are harm, I think is one of the most insidious ideas that has taken root, in the past while. I think yeah. I mean, I could go on for a long time, but maybe I'll shoot things over to John.
So the phenomenon being discussed here, I think some people call like the medicalization of disagreement. So it isn't, well, I disagree with you. It's, your views are so outrageous to me that it's going to give me an aneurysm and I'm going to collapse on the floor and, have to go to the ER. Like, I'm going to have a medical response to your views. And then there's a whole ecosystem of words. You're causing me trauma. Your words are like violence. You are erasing me. And yet, at the same, the paradox is, at the same time, all of this rhetoric is about, we have to create discomfort for the people who hold views that are different from us. So the idea of like causing discomfort is sort of romanticized, and often the people who say these things, they want to experience discomfort because it's seen as kind of like fasting or going to some kind of like meditation retreat, or like this sort of sacred suffering that they're going to do because they're going to gain enlightenment from it. The whole thing has a kind of like religious aspect to it. One thing I would add on the safety thing, though, is, first of all, there's a grain of truth to it. Like, I'm older. When I went to school, bullying was rampant. Schools put up with bullying. It was just part of the culture. And now, one good thing I can say for education, especially in Canada, there's like a zero tolerance attitude toward bullying. So, of course, it's like bullying will always exist and these policies are imperfect. But like, there is some reality to the safety thing. And a lot of it started with anti-bullying campaigns. And I mean, some of the anti-bullying rhetoric has been kind of co-opted for political purposes. But one good thing that's come out of this obsession with safety has been a pushback against bullying, which I think is fantastic. I talked to a woman named Sahar Tartak, who she just graduated high school, Long Island. She's not Canadian, but she's now at Yale. But what's interesting about her is she was kind of ideologically bullied at her high school because she wouldn't sign on to a lot of the stuff. And they took her to the principal's office, and it was like she was grilled. And she said, you know what, I want somebody else here with me to witness what's going on here. And they said, well, why? It's like the usual Kafka trap. Like, well, if you have nothing to hide, then why would you need a witness? And she said, well, I don't feel safe. Like, this is making me unsafe. And I said to her, I had her on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and I said to her, you're using progressive language. Like, that's like a politically correct thing to say. I don't feel safe. And she said, yeah, she acknowledges. She said, I felt kind of weird about it because it's like, I'm kind of weaponizing their own language against them. But she said, I don't see any other choice, because in these institutions, progressives have so thoroughly taken over the use of language that to get anything done, you kind of have to, like, judo style, like, use their words against them. And then you feel kind of dirty for doing it, because it's like, this is the kind of language that sort of makes me uncomfortable, and then I'm using it against my adversary. But in that context, I think you have no other choice but to use that kind of language to point out the hypocrisy of the other person. But then it becomes a kind of race to the bottom, like who feels more unsafe. And you already see that. And that's what intersectionality is kind of about, right? It's like, well, I'm gay and Filipino and poor. It's like, yeah, but I'm trans and I'm from Kenya and both my parents are dead. Like it sort of becomes this sort of competition to see who's more victimized.
The oppression Olympics.
The oppression Olympics, except like in this version of the Olympics, like the starting gun would sound and everyone would just collapse and start writhing around on the ground. Like there's just, it's a suffering competition. And again, people do suffer. Like it's not, there's more than a germ of truth to it. Intersectionality, I say, I agree with intersectionality in its basic form. Like if you're suffering racism and sexism at the same time, that sucks more than if you're suffering just racism or just sexism. If you then extrapolate that to a whole totalizing ideology about the universe, I don't agree with that. But a lot of these things have a grain of truth to it. And the safety stuff, the grain of truth, I think is, we want to be opposed to bullying and real violence, not word violence, but real violence. But then it just, again, it gets extrapolated for political reasons, self-serving reasons.
Well, and one very quick thing, and I know we probably have to wrap up soon, but one quick thing to add to that is that if we can't distinguish between, bullying or, sort of genuinely a genuinely harmful situation, and for example, just being in a room with someone who disagrees with me, then first of all, it minimizes and, it minimizes in a really kind of problematic way the seriousness of those real instances. But beyond that, it also creates a situation where where someone is basically feeling like if they're not sort of agreed with all the time, or if any time they're in a place where they're kind of, around sort of harmful ideas, if that becomes a harm to them, then that's going to have a huge impact on mental health. And I mean, we didn't talk very much about mental health, and it's obviously that's a whole nother conversation, but it's not
for the after show.
Right. It's not just a coincidence that we're in a mental health crisis. These things are not happening like coincidentally. It just so happens that we're seeing these trends. And by the way, there also is sort of massive, a massive crisis in mental health among young people. These things are related, and helping young people be mentally resilient, it involves also being able to draw a distinction between just having to be in an uncomfortable situation, like going on a live stream and not necessarily knowing what you're going to talk about, but knowing it'll probably be okay. Like that we don't have to crumble on the floor just because something is unpredictable or someone may have an opinion that's different than ours. And that, I think, is obviously it's another conversation, but I think it's an important addendum.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like we could talk for another couple of hours. This has been fantastic. And I appreciate you both coming on and spending your time. And I appreciate everyone that's watching and listening at home. And hopefully we'll talk soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Brandy.